You and I are, of course, animals with an internalized skeleton made out of different material, but largely calcium based. Fish, of course, are also vertebrate animals, and and like all other vertebrate animals, because of this internalized skeleton, we have the luxury of a softer outside, so to speak. Now, underwater, for animals like fish, they of course still need some kind of physical protection, which is unsurprising given that fish have scales that are, again, also largely made out of a calcium element. Now, of course, if you then get down to the more terrestrial animals like your goats in this case, and a pig in this case, you of course also still have that internalized skeleton, but on the outside, your really nice and soft skin, we don't necessarily require the rigidity that insects have come to possess for many different reasons. And the result of which is that what we cannot do is use a really structured material to form our outside, our external sort of skeleton, so to speak. We need the softness, we need the flexibility, we need that elasticity. And so for a lot of us, that has taken the shape and form of keratin. Keratin is a really highly versatile polysaccharide. It is protein based. And of course, if you basically take, say, a bunch of what do you call those? A bunch of wires really, but I was thinking pipe cleaners. And if you imagine they all run parallel to each other, and then you start twisting and twisting and twisting. So the tighter the twist or the more twists that you have, then the stronger the material becomes, which also makes something like keratin very easy to manipulate and have varying levels of plasticity. Now, of course, there are versions of keratin that bind together even more so, and some mammals, like the horns of goats, are incredibly tough, and that is still made of keratin. So in a lot of vertebrates, keratin was the chosen sort of polysaccharide to give us some form of structure, but still a lot of flexibility. Now, plants, on the other hand, you're probably familiar with the rigidity of the plant cell wall, which is why when they get stained in microscopy, they take on so much pigment because they are a really tough matrix. And of course, their structural I guess molecule here is cellulose, and cellulose has so much wonderful properties, but in essence, because it's so structural, it basically locks and forms these matrices embedded within the cell wall of a plant. Now, as a result of which, you can just sort of think as concrete hardens, that it gives it a lot of strength, but little to no flexibility, which is why plants at certain tension points are easy to break. But of course, there are certain plants that then take the cellulose one step further and get to produce even tougher things like lignin, which you will, of course, find in your woods. Now, the reason why I'm going through all of the structural sort of proteins involved across variety of life, we've got the keratin that relates to you and I. Then why did I bother with talking about things like cellulose and lignin? I think I want you to appreciate the structural complexity of those things because there are many insects that actually specialize in breaking them down, which also means that the energetic requirements to break down things as tough as cellulose and as tough as lignin cannot be done by one insect alone. But it is, in fact, bacteria that they have a very close association with, whether it's on their gut or in their saliva, that assists with breaking down that really tough material. Which brings us to the choice of polysaccharide for insects. What they don't want is to be completely rigid like plants. But what they also don't want, given that they lack an internalized skeleton, is they can't be as soft and flexible as us on the outside. And so the happy medium that a lot of arthropods have chosen is this amazing thing called chitin, which is also a polysaccharide. Now you'll notice that the arrangement of chitin has quite beautiful symmetry. And you can see here that this coil or this helix structure, not unfamiliar to you because you've learned about that helicoidal DNA structure. In a weird way, it is similar in that layer upon layer of chitinous strands basically overlap slowly and form slowly but surely a helix like this. But if we break that down, you'll notice that each strand of chitin is actually a composition of what we would describe as a crystal or crystalline region, as well as an amorphous region. And in this diagram here, you can see that it is an alternation of crystalline and amorphous regions. And you can probably guess just by looking at this figure that the crystalline region, as the name suggests, is the tough part. The amorphous region is the soft part that allows some level of flexibility. So in many ways, insects have opted for a polysaccharide to give them structural integrity that is somewhere between the tough, completely structured plants and the hyper soft, super flexible, keratinized outer covering of, say, mammals. Now, this crystalline region are areas where the chitin polymer chains are tightly packed, they're highly ordered, and they're aligned parallel to each other. And molecularly, both internally and intramolecularly, there are just lots and lots of hydrogen bonds. Okay. Now, what is the functional significance of this crystalline, this hard bit? Because it's hard, it's got high mechanical strength, right? It's so dense, it's so densely packed, so it's strong, it's stiff, and it's going to be quite resistant to compression. And importantly, it's also going to be very difficult for enzymes to break apart, which is also why in a lot of insectivorous gut content analysis, when people do research on gut content analysis of things that eat insects, chitin pretty much stays intact. Now, in the context of this amorphous region of chitin, they're basically when now the polymer chains of the chitin become more loosely packed, they're not arranged in a very regular pattern, they're quite irregular. And the reason why it can do this is because there's simply fewer hydrogen bonds. And because of this, unsurprisingly, it offers a little bit more flexible, or what sometimes is called the soft spots, right? So it allows bending. It allows some level of deformation without breaking, but importantly, it dissipates mechanical energy, which is very crucial, particularly for insects that are small, insects that need to maneuver very, very quickly, or insects that need to hide within crevices. So having rigidity yet some level of flexibility is helpful. But I think what is most important is that these two parts, right, when they are side by side and alternating, they also determine the availability of things like water, like ions, like enzymes, how much it can perforate through the chitin. So, of course, the crystalline structures, there's little to no perforation, whereas the amorphous regions, things like ions and waters and enzymes can still pass through, right? So if you think holistically in terms of the animal's ability to retain water, right, to prevent respiratory water loss, chitin itself is I guess a building block that allows the insect to have some level of plasticity in that regard. So if we sort of summarize the three sort of core structural building blocks, right? We talked a little bit about the animal cell being this lipid bilayer that you're familiar with. It's really, really soft. And then in some cases, structured with some keratin, like in our hair and in like our fingernails, but still soft, right? Our hair is soft. Our fingernails are arguably also soft. Now, plant cells, of course, their version of structure comes in the shape and form of cellulose. This was the matrix I was talking about. But the problem with that matrix, the limit of that matrix is if you want to put something through it, it's not very easy. Whereas in organisms that invest in chitin, in this case, fungi also have chitin. Now, fungi are slightly different in that unlike the insects we saw a while ago, the insect's organization of, or I should say arthropodan organization of chitin includes regions where there are polymers of chitin that are tightly packed versus regions that are not so tightly packed, and as in so doing, give it some flexibility. Whereas in fungi, the chitin matrix is actually still quite soft, but allows things to embed within them. So hopefully this gives you a nice idea of the fact that there are so many solutions to the same sort of problems related to form and holding the form, having that structural integrity. And in the case of the insects, chitin was that building block.